Hi, good afternoon. I know we're just a bit early, but since many of us are assembled and it's a little tight, maybe we'll get started, and that might allow some more time for questions after. Hi, my name is Ray Bruzzi, and I'm going to read from the side on this side here, sorry. I'm the program director for Wiley Digital Archives. On behalf of Wiley, our panelists, and myself, thank you for coming to this afternoon's session on transforming research in your library through digital archives. Wiley has a 200-year history of academic publishing with a strong focus on STEM as well as other disciplines, and we partner with over 650 learned societies around the world to publish journals and other publications which advance research and education. Most of my colleagues at Wiley spend their time looking forward, and they're rightly focused on what's next across STEM fields. My job at Wiley is to look backwards into the past and to understand the evolution of the sciences and the disciplines within STEM through the lens of archival historical materials. Wiley partners with some of our societies to create digital collections of primary source archives, and that ties in directly to today's discussion. Our panel is meant to provide an overview into the digitization programs from the perspective of our end users, from the societies which hold archival content, from those responsible for maintaining archives and creating pathways of access to materials through digitization, and from institutions which collect digital archives but also lead their own efforts to create digital resources. We'll try to provide information and insights into the challenges around digitization from multiple perspectives, and we'll also talk about the benefits of successful programs. We don't have a lot of time today for what we're trying to cover, so let me go ahead and introduce our panel in the order in which they'll be presenting. We'll start with what we might consider the end user, the persona at the heart of any good academic digitization program, in this case personified by Dr. Jacob Steer-Williams. Jacob received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2011. His teaching and research interests are in science, history, British history, the British Empire, and he specializes in the history of science, medicine, and disease. Jacob has worked extensively with British and British colonial archives, and his work has been funded by the Wellcome Trust. He'll speak today about his experiences in working with archives, partnering with university libraries, and about integrating digital resources into his teaching and learning. Dr. Douglas Bratton is Chief Scientific Officer for Science Publications at the New York Academy of Sciences, and Editor-in-Chief of the 194-year-old journal Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Doug will speak about recent initiatives he led to celebrate the Academy's 200th anniversary in 2017, and this includes collecting and cataloging the Academy's archives and what their digitization will achieve. Pamela Ford is the archive manager at the Royal College of Physicians. She's responsible for almost 5 centuries of historical records and has an MA in Archives Administration from the University of Liverpool, as well as an MA in Philosophy, which might serve her well when confronting that much content. She's currently working on the archives programming and leading up to the RCP's 500-year anniversary in 2018, and we'll speak about creating pathways to access for that collection via digitization efforts. Rounding out our speakers today is Tim Bucknell. Tim is the Assistant Dean of University Library, and Head of Electronic Resources and Information Technologies at UNC Greensboro. Tim is founder and convener of the Carolina Consortium, and inventor of Journal Finder, the first open URL link resolver. Tim will be speaking about people, not property collections in terms of collaboration, partnerships, grant funding, and classroom education, as well as creating access to digital collections through his institution. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with Dr. Steer-Williams.
Thanks, Ray. So I've been called a lot of things in my professional career, but end user is new to me. So hopefully my remarks today for someone who has, for the better part of a decade and the time that I was trained as a professional historian and have now in the last 6 or 7 years been researching and teaching as a professional historian. Hopefully these remarks will be helpful for us in thinking about what I think is, in many ways, one of the more interesting things about the time that I have become a professional historian is this new cusp of digital archives and thinking through digital archives. And I've been involved with a number of pedagogical and research initiatives in the last decade with using digital archives and thinking about digital archives, particularly in the history of medicine and the history of science and in British imperial history. In 2016, for example, I was part of a National Library of Medicine workshop titled Images and Texts in Medical History, and slightly before that I was a consultant with the Wellcome Institute before they launched and helping to launch the London's Pulse Digital Archives, which is a collection, for those of you unfamiliar, of medical officer of health reports for metropolitan London dating back to 1848. I'd like to split my remarks today for you in thinking about the use and the direction of digital archives into both teaching and research avenues as I see them, but really start with some general thoughts that fuse my end user, it's so odd for me to use that term, perspective on digital archives a little bit more broadly that will hopefully dovetail and mesh with issues about content selection and preservation and digitization. And as I've sort of reflected in thinking about this panel and my role in digital archives and using them, I think I sort of characterize this professional scholarly community right now and the folks that I talk to as my colleagues on campus and at professional historical meetings as a kind of tepid excitement over digital archives right now in the community of professional historians. So on the one hand, there is this excitement about the growing access to digital archives. So when I was a graduate student, for example, using British archival sources, something like official parliamentary papers, I had to trudge to the library to use the British parliamentary oversized green folios in person, in hand. Those in the time since have been digitized and are full text searchable by ProQuest. Very easy and I think innovative way in which I use archival research on a daily basis. Similarly, the massive amount of digital archives on places like archive.org and the digitization of popular medical journals such as The Lancet and the British Medical Journal being two pioneering ones that have long since been digitized. These, I think, scholars like myself have understood to be real, tangible benefits to scholarly research. And as a researcher who uses digital archives regularly, in fact, almost daily in my research, it makes my research and really at a university like mine, a smaller liberal arts university, my somewhat meager research travel budget, much, much, much easier. But a growing number of scholars like myself are also beginning to see and engage with digital archives and see that they can lead to new historical questions that move us beyond and somewhat parallel to traditional historical methods of textual analysis. And using what I think is rather sophisticated and what computer scientists think is probably rather elementary methods in data science and data programming and what's increasingly being called text mining. And in fact, many graduate programs in history for doctorates in history are providing this kind of training in basic computer science to be able to analyze digital archives in new ways, starting with the pioneering program that most of you are probably familiar with at George Mason. I'll give you one example of this. I'm finishing a book right now on typhoid fever in Victorian Britain and across the British Empire. And I did a study recently using a Python script, a really pretty simple computer program, where I took data from 100 years of the British Medical Journal and the Lancet, doing differential analysis of every time the word typhoid was used and the word enteric, which was another synonym for the disease throughout the 19th century. And I had a hunch as to seeing those in the archives, traditional modes of my research, but I didn't really know the big picture or the visualization of that evidence. And using some data mining and some computer programming, I was able to actually come up with some very new and innovative ways to look at my own research that has led to some new answers, but more importantly, some new questions. So what that's enabled me to do and to see, and I think there's a growing number of scholars who are seeing digital archives in this way, is that digital archives are not going to replace traditional modes of historical analysis, but they can lead to some new questions. And I think that's one really exciting and innovative in some ways. So one question that I was thinking about that would be useful that folks on the other side of digital archives probably would want to ask end users like myself is, what do scholars think they need with digital archives? And the first thing that I would say is more, and more emphatically, but also more of the right kinds of digital primary sources. So, you know, from my perspective in the history of medicine and science, the history of the British Empire, what we need are more non-traditional sources, moving beyond the official government sources or the official voices from medical journals like the Lancet or the BMJ. We need digital archives that reflect new approaches in the scholarship. So in the history of medicine, that's bottom-up approaches from patients, bottom-up approaches about scientific practice, the voices of non-Western people, of colonial environments, and to new nods and movements in historical scholarship towards visual culture and towards thinking about ephemera in historical research. And that's why I'm really excited about some of the new developments in digitization that I've been following. Adam Matthews has a new project on popular medicine in America, which includes a bunch of really innovative texts of popular medicine and patent medicine. Wiley's new Science and Medicine digital archives projects is including a whole range of ephemera that I'm really interested to get my hands on for research purposes. But moving beyond research, I think where digital archives have just made my life easier, not having to travel to Britain or parts of the former British Empire, as an educator, digital archives are really a game changer. So most historians that I know still rely on readers like this, primary source anthologies that have been curated and put together by historians that we use in the classroom. In addition to that, in the last decade, as most of you are aware, historians in their classrooms have included primary source excerpts as PDFs from fair use education from online collections like archive.org, like Google Scholar, like the National Library of Medicine or the Wellcome Institute. But one thing that I think is becoming increasingly clear in the classroom through the use of digital archives is one of the problems with old readers like this, collections of primary sources, is that they take primary sources out of their historical context. And one of the real values, I think, of digital archives is the ability to reach more students through using primary sources in their historical context. So I'll give you an example of that. London's Pulse, the Wellcome Institute's digitization project of medical officer of health reports. I've had a group of university students that I've taught for 2 semesters now conduct, and these are undergraduates, conduct original, innovative historical research using those digital archives and getting into the historical context. The texts aren't taken out of their context, they're in their entirety. So in thinking about some of the initiatives, I know, for example, the Wiley new series is doing the Royal Anthropological Institute, doing the entire run of them. Using those kinds of sources that are primary sources in their entirety, I think present really new and innovative pathways for giving undergraduate and graduate students real, authentic source material for their projects. So just to really conclude here, I think scholars are looking for new and more digital archives, but the right kind of digital archives that are, as I've sort of thinking about this term, contextually curated, not just cherry-picked and included in big multi-institutional and multi-archival sources. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be here in sunny Charleston. This is my first visit. It was very interesting listening to the remarks. I come from a science academy that, as Ray said, is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. And for us, we want to be both a supplier of a useful archive and a user. And what I mean by that is the process of going through our archives, developing it, and understanding it for our 200th anniversary, which we've been doing now for about 1.5 years, is really a reclamation for us of our history and the history of our society in New York, And that means other institutions in New York that we were involved with over the 200 years. And it really is surprising to me how little our current academy would think about its history. And of course now, since we're part and in the year of celebrating the 200th anniversary, we're focused on that. But for years, there was really an absence of reflecting on the history of the New York Academy of Sciences and its influence in institutions in New York. And a reflection of that sort of indifference to our history, our archive had ended up in boxes in a warehouse in Queens, and there it sat for many, many years. No one really knew what was in it. That's a shame, obviously. But thank God we had the 200th anniversary coming up. We decided that we really needed to take care of the archives. We hired an archivist, brought them in-house, and went through them carefully and tried to understand our history. We developed the first timeline that we ever had of important people and events that have occurred over the past 200 years. At a certain point in that project, we were unsure of what we could do with the archive. We were thinking of donating it, putting it somewhere, but there it would just sit and not be used. And so we were very surprised and appreciative of this sudden opportunity that Wiley presented to us, being able to digitize the archives. And it really is, in a way, a final step in a long process that we've had together. The Academy has been working with Wiley for, probably 12 years or so. And before that time, the Academy published its journal on its own. And at a certain point, it was clear we didn't have the wherewithal to do that in an effective way. And so we teamed up with Wiley. And one of the first things we did together was to digitize the back file of the journal that Ray mentioned, Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, which was a terrific addition, and it is, in fact, since I think 2005, been one of the most used and purchased back files that Wiley has produced over the years. And 3 years ago, we followed that up with digitization of another journal that has historical information about the Academy, and a very influential magazine that the New York Academy of Sciences published in the 1970s called The Sciences. So that was the beginning of our archives, our history. But being able to add to it, to really include this wealth of information, this vein of historical fact that would otherwise have sat in a warehouse in Queens, is invaluable to us. So we are hoping to be users of it, but we also want others to mine it and find out the wonderful things in it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ray said, I manage the archives of the Royal College of Physicians in London, and I've been managing these archives for 14 years now. So my organisation has always been very invested in and proud of its long history. So our anniversary year will be coming up. We will be officially 500 years old on the 23rd of September 2018. We were founded by King Henry VIII. So, you know, just a few little bits back there in the back room. So I'm actually in the position of having currently about 40,000 hard copy items in the archives. That's plus about 35,000 rare books and special collections, which are also part of our research offering. And obviously, our archives don't stop when the hard copy stops. We are continually collecting our ongoing records of what we do and who we are to put into our archive all the time. And we're actually investing in digital solutions for long-term born digital archives as well. So digitization, apart from helping us improve access for other reasons, should also really help us to provide a single source for our long-term history, past, present, and going into the future, which is really very important for us. Now, over the past 14 years, I have been doing a lot of work on identifying what we actually hold in those 40,000 items, and what audiences and services and products we might be able to pull out of those 40,000 items. Because this is absolutely crucial when you want to put together a strategy of where you want to be in 1 year's time, 5 years' time, 20 years' time. You need to absolutely know what you have and what its potential is. And as a result of doing that, I've basically come up with 2 strategic goals. The first strategic goal is to ensure that I preserve a complete and honest record of who we are and what we do as a core value for our organization. Very important for us. And the second priority, strategic priority for myself, which is why the Wiley project is going to be so really helpful for us, is the fact that we want to continue to be an authoritative source for the history of medicine and the study of the history of medicine. So those are really 2 of our long-term goals. And so any project that we put together, we want to ensure that it falls into those 2 areas. So preservation, for example, there are always going to be risks and unexpected happenings. So, for example, in the Great Fire of London in 1666, we lost not only our premises, but almost all of our records. Now, admittedly, that probably hasn't happened to a lot of your organizations, but fire, flood, conflict are ever-present potential issues. So therefore, I'm actually digitizing for preservation to ensure that should anything ever happen physically, we maintain that digital record of who we are and what we've been doing throughout our long life. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how you decide to resource digitization projects, because for us, we have an issue not an issue, it's a good issue to have, but we have 40,000 items in the archive. How do we choose what to digitize? How do we choose what is of most value to current researchers, future studies in the history of medicine? As has been said before, the patient experience has become a really important trend in research, but that's only emerged in the last few years. So how much can we anticipate trends? So for us, the idea, we can't digitize everything, so we do have to try and pick up resourcing models which focus on priority areas. And commercial partnerships are a really good way of picking on the things which are saleable, marketable, profitable. But there are so many other things which are perhaps small scale, not particularly profitable, which you also want to make available open source as a digital product. But obviously you may have to use other methods to fund it. So we have in the past done combinations of charitable funding and internal investment to also support our digitization project, because all 3 models together are helping us build up a digital portfolio which will enable us to preserve our history and also to preserve and make available things which are of interest only to ourselves, perhaps, or to a small set of audiences, but then also work on the things which have a much wider reach. So, for example, we have 19th century global questionnaires on the state of medicine and the state of medical knowledge across all of the colonies of England at the time. And that's going to be a great resource for the history of medicine, and that's a prime candidate for a commercial partnership, because that colonial viewpoint and snapshot across the globe is obviously something which can be cherry-picked, but it goes hand in hand with perhaps more boring administrative record series, which have their place and their value, but perhaps are not something that is in a commercial product would be of particular value at the moment. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, there would have been a lot more interest in digitizing the record series. So we're not basically expecting to be able to digitize everything immediately. So we are using very much a staged approach with all of our partners, charitable funding partners, internal investors and commercial partners, to try and ensure that we get to a place where we meet our two strategic goals through a series of steps and measures. And one of the things I wanted to just sort of finish with was that sometimes you get an opportunity to develop a project, and you develop it and it's great and you put out a commercial product and everyone's happy. What we have failed to do in the past is truly maximize internally the additional benefits we could have taken from that project. So whenever you digitize with a partner, you often get a lot of raw content back into your repository. And so often you sort of put it on a shelf, metaphorically speaking, and you don't actually exploit any of it yourself, despite the fact that there is a value internally to a lot of that material. So we have in the past, metaphorically, put that raw content up on the shelf. And what I want to really focus on going forward is to maximize the benefits from our partnerships and really pull out all the areas where we can take that raw content that we're getting back and actually exploit it appropriately for ourselves and our audiences in other ways which support the core project they came from, but which also really give us so much added value. So even though you do go into this partnership and the partner puts in a lot of resource, it's so worthwhile for us as an organization to put in an equivalent amount of resource and effort to really double our gain. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the next 5 to 10 years, beyond our anniversary, because obviously this coming year is going to be pretty big in terms of events and activities. So if you are in London in 2018, do look us up. Thank you.
I'm going to share some thoughts on how academic libraries resource various digitized archives. Broadly speaking, the UNCG libraries are building two different kinds of digital archives with two different audiences in mind. First, obviously, we need to serve our students and faculty. We need to make sure our students are successful in the classroom and our faculty have the resources they need to do research and publish. And that part's really pretty straightforward. You know, they come to us and say, we need this certain product. There's something out there that we want that we know of that you should buy for us. And we go to the commercial publishers, negotiate prices, and if the price is right, we purchase it for them. So that part's pretty straightforward. It's the other audience that's really complicated. The other audience is the external audience. UNCG libraries, like most academic libraries anywhere, have unique and rare content that we have some responsibility to digitize and make available to the world. And while we use our collections budget to purchase things for our students and faculty, we don't have a particular budget for digitizing content for others. So we have to get creative about it. It depends on how we count them. We've digitized nearly 100 collections at UNCG, ranging from the papers of the first female doctor in North Carolina to annotated scores and correspondence from ours, which is the world's largest collection of cello music. Each collection has its own unique benefits and challenges, but the one I want to talk about, which kind of exemplifies lots of different approaches within one area, is the Digital Library on American Slavery. The Digital Library on American Slavery began as a collaboration between our library and one of our history professors, Dr. Lawrence Schweninger. And he had driven all across the South and visited all the county courthouses and state capitals and found all of the legal petitions filed at the county or state level that so much as mentioned enslaved individuals in any way. These aren't cases about the institution of slavery. These are cases about a stolen horse or public drunkenness or dowry or divorces, all kinds of things. But anything that even mentioned enslaved individuals in any way, he Xeroxed. So he had this huge pile of Xeroxed papers that he needed to provide broader access to. So he provided the historian's vision and the direction. The library provided the IT muscle, so we built the front end and architected his database and did the user interface and all that stuff. And the NEH and the Mott and Mellon Foundations provided the funding. The final product contains over 150,000 named individuals and is extremely heavily used by genealogists, historians, and other researchers. And this is an incredible, it's really an emotive product to go through and look at. It has high impact and reaches hundreds of thousands of users every year, and we get lots of response back from people saying this is just really incredible, particularly genealogists. And based on that just overwhelming response, we thought, hey, this is a hit. So is there some other complementary collections that we can add and kind of build and create kind of a center of excellence here? So the next Digital Library of American Slavery project we did was the North Carolina Runaway Slave Ads. We are a UNC system school, so we have a special responsibility for North Carolina history. So we partnered with another UNC school, North Carolina A&T, to get an LSTA grant to digitize all the runaway slave ads for North Carolina newspapers from 1751 to 1840. So you might notice something about that. 1840 is not emancipation, so we're missing 25 years. We did that range because a prior historian had already done a bibliography that listed all the ads. They weren't digitized, they weren't available, but it was a list. So we did the ones that were listed because they were easier. Now we still want to do the other 25 years. So we went to UNCG, was doing some grants for innovative classroom activities and said, hey, if you will give us some money, we will work with graduate students in the Library and Information Science program and graduate students in the Public History program and get those two groups together, and they can look at how best to do that next 25 years. So they can kind of cut their teeth on a real product with real value that reaches a lot of people. When they graduate, they will have that extra experience. And we did get that grant. And that's going to lead to a bigger grant, we think, to finish digitizing those last 25 years. The next piece that we did for the Digital Library in American Slavery is called People, Not Property. Because enslaved individuals were considered property, there are deeds of ownership that the registrars of deeds have in 100, well, not in all 100 North Carolina counties, because, yeah, there are fires in the U.S. too, and we also have problems and we lose our records. So we do have a significant number of deeds, and we are a finalist for an NHPRC grant. Wish us luck. We should hear within the next few weeks. And we have already worked with genealogists, community members, libraries, and registrars of deeds to complete the database design and the process for collection, and we hope to get started on that very soon. So, point being, within this one project, the Digital Library on American Slavery that we created, we used 2 private foundation grants, 2 federal grants, a state grant, and a UNCG grant. We used student work through classroom integration so that UNCG history and LIS students got firsthand experience in building digital collections. We worked directly with the UNCG faculty member to digitally publish his research, because Dr. Schweninger is a genius, He knows nothing about IT. He could not have done this project without a partner like us. We collaborate with community partners through an advisory board. We partnered with public and academic libraries in the North Carolina Division of Archives and Records. And we partnered with museums, genealogical societies, and with registrars of deeds from across the state. So again, for this internal audience, it's pretty straightforward. Faculty want something, we see if we've got the money to get that for them, and if so, we buy it. And partly that's a really time-sensitive decision. If faculty need something for their research or class, they can't wait for us to go apply for grants and spend years building something and collaborate with a bunch of people. They just need it. But for the external audience, that time pressure is off, and we have time to really explore lots of different avenues. And these different avenues have huge benefits because we're partnering with people in the classroom. That really helps them. We're partnering with our community members. We're bringing money to the institution. So it's really exciting, all the options and potentials of reaching out to others and building these collaborative digital collections. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers and our panelists, and a quick word about the photos. I'm old enough to remember microfilm. You remember targets in microfilm, right? Where you are. Those idiotic pictures of myself are targets. So I know which institution I'm looking at, and so my son knows where I am. The reason there are such a variety of photographs there is so that I understand the scope of the content, whether I'm dealing with printed material, handwritten material, whether it's stapled, whether it's oversized, how it's stored, whether it might need conservation, what sort of assessment we might need. And I usually have a documents handling specialist and an archivist with me so that we can make those kinds of assessments. So it's not entirely random. But I didn't realize I was in there so often. Sorry. So I wanted to see if there were questions. And if we can elaborate on any of the points made by the speakers so concisely in such a brief amount of time. Yes, in the back. Yeah, Tim, did you want to take that?
Well, they're always looking for collaboration and partnership. You have very little chance of having a successful grant application if you're going it alone. So find other partners, and you want them to be complementary. You don't want them to be similar institutions to your own. Get a different type of institution. And you need to have some kind of way to assert the relevancy of the material that you're doing. You have to have some way of knowing that the end product is something that's going to be in very, very high demand. And it's hard to know the future, of course, but it helps to have, a board or some kind of, have faculty that endorse it, have people who really ought to know what's of lasting value, and have them write letters of recommendation and support for your project.
Right. And I could add one point to that, having consulted and having helped a number of institutional projects along, and that is to have a plan to reach your audience after the archive is prepared and have that as part of your proposal for funding. I think seeing what you would call in the commercial world a go-to-market strategy, and how you're going to reach those end users, how you're going to engage with them, and how you're going to get the word out through conferences, through channels, through, I guess listservs isn't really a thing, through other areas where those scholars live to bring them to you. It shows them that the impact of what you're doing, you're prepared not just to foster that impact, but to handle it when it gets to the project. Is there another question? Yes, Bob?
That is a very good question, yes. The questionnaire that got sent out to all the colonies did consist of a very set number of questions. And yes, so we could absolutely produce a very structured resource based on that. The variables are that all of the responses are completely handwritten, completely variable in terms of content, tone, and how much is written. And also, because it's 19th century, because it's talking about colonies, there are sensitivities of language that we will need to interpret and explain for modern audiences. So absolutely, yes. I don't have a particular specific strategy as yet for how I'm going to maximize the potential internally of our product. But I'm just aware that in the past we have failed to do this. And so as part of this project ongoing, I'm going to be committing internal resource to identify those growth areas and actually work on perhaps even putting in funding bids to put together a systematic resource with someone else who's also got something that's very similar. So yes, the possibilities are really quite wide, and I'm looking forward to sort of finding out what they are and really working on them.
Yeah, I know we're just at time. Are there any other questions we might answer? No? On behalf of Wiley and myself, I want to thank Pamela, Tim, Doug, and Jacob for their time, and thank you for your attendance and questions today. Thank you.